Hello, and welcome to Complete College America's CCA Week. We appreciate all of you taking time out of your busy schedules to join us for our conversations today and welcoming you to our conversations about equity and justice for all. Today, I have the esteemed pleasure of partnering with Dr. Estela Mara Bensimon, who is a professor of higher education at the USC Rossier School of Education and the director of this former director now of the Center for Urban Education, which she founded in 1999 and which merged on July 1st of this year with the USC Race and Equity Center. To increase equity in higher education outcomes for students of color, Dr. Bensimon has developed the Equity Scorecard, a process for using inquiry to drive changes in institutional practice and culture. Dr. Bensimon also has published extensively about the issues of racial equity, organizational learning, practitioner inquiry, and change. As a result of her efforts, she has been lauded with many commendations, including the National Academy of Education. She was appointed to the Education Commission of the States. And just this year, she was honored with ASH's Howard Bowen Award for a distinguished career. And last week, she received the McGraw Prize for Innovation in Higher Education. So this woman knows of which she speaks. Her most recent book, From Equity Talk to Equity Walk, Expanding Practitioner Knowledge for Racial Justice in Higher Education, co-authored with Tia Brown McNair and Lindsay Malcolm Piquot, was published in 2020. She also serves on the board of directors of the Campaign for College Opportunity and Complete College America. And after I share a couple of slides with you, the next voice from which you will hear will be that of Dr. Estela Mara Bensimon. So I'll share some information with you first before Dr. Bensimon speaks. At CCA, we understand that we are at an inflection point. We've been taking a fresh look at our impact, and as we thought back about what's been our unique role in the higher education agenda for these past 11 years, we've been really focused on making sure that we continue to focus on our policy and practice, as well as the unique perspectives, but then also what do we need to look for in the future? And we know that as much as we're continuing to focus on the mission and the vision of CCA, we wanna make sure that everything we do has an equity lens and perspective. And while this has been certainly a part of our history since our founding in the year 2009, we wanna make sure though that as we continue to think about how the landscape has changed, who are the students that are being welcomed into higher education, and how do institutions and structures need to change to become more student ready, especially for the students of this new millennia. Next slide, please. So we've been listening and learning, and the year 2020, as we know, has really been a combination of between the pandemic, the global pandemic that we are all experiencing mutually, as well as the issues of racial justice that we've been contending with and issues of economic instability. And so we've been very active, believe it or not, during the pandemic. We've had multiple town halls. We've regionalized our structure for the ways that we engage with our alliance. We've really focused on how we can utilize data innovation through the post-secondary data partnership. We've actually looked at the ways that we can partner with our institutional partners, our state partners, our 47 alliance members, as well as our organizational partners in order to deepen equity impact of our strategies. We've really made sure that you can track resources better in our CCA portal and that we can also highlight alliance successes and national concerns. We've also been showcasing the experiences of our students, and we did that through our 20 for 20 grads campaign this year, looking at those graduates who weren't able to walk across the stage in the year 2020, but certainly want to highlight their experiences at institutions that have been deploying our game changer strategies and that really have student success at their forefront. We've been engaging in critical conversations with higher education leaders. And so this conversation today will be a continuation of that and having honest dialogue with partners around holding them accountable for equity gaps in higher education. And so we're gonna have more conversation again, as I mentioned to you, talking in this convening. We had our 2019 convening, and I met many of you at our 2018 convening. Of course, because of the pandemic, we postponed our annual convening this year until next year. So while CCA Week does not replace the annual convening, we hope that this engagement will allow you to contend with and grapple with some of the issues that we know are vitally important. And so next slide, please. I wanted to let you all know that there will be Q&A at the end of this conversation. You can put your questions in the chat. And we've also reserved time at the end to address any questions that you have. And so you can toggle between the live Q&A option below the streaming video to send your questions. But again, as I mentioned in the beginning, I wanted to introduce to you Dr. Estela Mara Bensimon, and I will turn it over to her to talk about some of the strategies that we've talked about in real time, how she's grappling with those in terms of equity in the work that she does. Thank you and welcome, Dr. Bensimon.
Thank you very much, Yolanda. And I'm going to try to put on my, my PowerPoint right now. So I need for someone at Complete College America to allow me to do that. I think I need to be made a co-host. So in the meantime, as that is going on, I want to thank you for the lovely introduction, Yolanda. I also want to say hello to everyone who is out there, as well as to my colleagues on the board of Complete College America. Last year, when Yolanda invited me to be part of the board, I was really honored because I never imagined that I would be a member of such an important organization. So one thing I have to tell you all is that I am technologically challenged. And right now I am madly looking for how to share the screen. Okay, got it here. All right, I hope that you are, oops, are you seeing both my slide as well as the next slide?
Yeah.
Okay, let me see if I can fix that. Hold on. All right, I think that what I will need to do is unplug my, yes, okay.
No worries, and we can place the slides up too if you need us to.
No, I think, is that better?
There you go, perfect.
All right. I wanted to start out by acknowledging that the vicious murders of Black men and Black women by brutal means committed by police officers, along with other horrific racist acts, as well as the legitimation of white supremacy, such as the Proud Boys and the QAnon movement, as well as the refusal of many of our elected leaders to call them out as hate groups, have energized the anti-racist movement in the United States. And with the horrendous deaths and murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, as well as Ahmaud Arbery, the dictum, Black Lives Matter, is being voiced in the streets of corporate America, in signs posted all over my neighborhood, in signs posted all over Rodeo Drive in Beverly Hills, and it is embedded in the speeches of college presidents. And if you read the Sunday New York Times, you will see that even Vogue magazine, that bastion of whiteness, is going through a reckoning and has dedicated their most important annual issue, September, to Black artists, Black designers, and models. So it would appear that that racism seems to be at the top of the agenda, or at least that's how it appears from the headlines of newspapers and magazines like the New Yorker, Vanity Fair, and The Atlantic. Attacks on racism and anti-Blackness are ubiquitous on social media. Even at my own university, Black students now have an Instagram in which they share all of the microaggressions and racial abuse that they experience at USC. We have not seen such a major racial reckoning in the United States since the Civil Rights Act and the marches on Selma, the Washington March, which all of that culminated in the Civil Rights Amendment, as well as in many progressive policies, the Voting Rights Act, affirmative action, increased financial aid to open up higher education for previously excluded students, and more support for historically Black colleges and universities. This was the moment of Lyndon Johnson's Great Society, and it appeared as if things were changing, as Bob Dylan famously sang. But unfortunately, the advances of the civil rights movement lasted a very short time. And as a more conservative political agenda took over and the rise of the ascendancy of neoliberal ideology led to the abandonment of many of the gains that we made through the civil rights movement and the abandonment of racial equity as a right and as a moral obligation. So one of the consequences is that equity, which I believe is a moral imperative, is now being commodified for self-interest because it has become a trend. And so one of the things that I am going to speak about today is about how do we decenter, in a way, whiteness in definitions of equity. I am going to be drawing on articles that I wrote in the last 2 years in Change magazine. One of them is Reclaiming Racial Justice and Equity. Another one is Paying Off the Racial Debt in Higher Education. And the third one is Our First Generation Equity Practitioners, the Part of the Problem. That first generation equity practitioner is a play on the way in which we speak about first generation students. And I'll also be drawing on the book that Yolanda mentioned, as well as more recent work that I have been doing through 2 grants from the Gates Foundation. One that focuses on the Solution Network's Strong Start to Finish advising and Every Learner Everywhere, as well as a policy grant to examine how to build capacity to implement remedial developmental education reforms and pathways with a focus on racial equity. So, so this is what my talk is about, settling the debt higher education owes for racial injustice. And when I say the debt, what I'm talking about is that, that higher education has a long history of having excluded racially minoritized students. It wasn't really until the late 60s that higher education opened up for Blacks, for Latinx, and for Indigenous students. And but if we want to have a reckoning and we want to pay off this debt that we have to talk about whiteness, and we have to talk specifically about how we decenter whiteness in equity. How do we decenter whiteness in the reforms we construct and we advocate? And then how can we get on and stay on the path to racial equity? So some of you who may be listening to me right now may have heard that I often say that when I founded the Center for Urban Education, no one was talking about equity. At the time, the trend was to talk about diversity, and it was also to talk about the achievement gap. But racial equity was not really on the agenda. And like I said, it kind of got left behind when the one moment of triumph of the civil rights movement just sort of died off. So what was interesting to me in 2000 is that there was also a very robust accountability movement, and institutions of higher education were being made more conscious about their outcomes. And in some states, there were funding formulas that were based at least partially on outcomes. But in looking at the frameworks for outcomes, whether in Pennsylvania, in Wisconsin, and in any other states, equity was not part of the accountability agenda. So when I started this work, I decided that I wanted to focus on racial equity in part as an accountability, as a means of accountability. And that's why much of the work that I have done focuses on outcomes and proportionality in outcomes. So now we're here in 2020, and like I said earlier, equity has become a trend. You see it everywhere. And so what I am worried about is that because equity is suddenly a source, could be a source of revenue, that it may be getting commodified and it will lose its power in terms of it being a racial justice movement. So here is what equity is not. A lot of people think that because they disaggregate their data by race and ethnicity, they are doing equity work. Often what I see is that to signal that that equity is being paid attention to, it's at the end of a long sentence, there may be, and for students of color. Equity is not caring about all students. In fact, if we say that we care about all students, we are really not engaging in equity work, because equity, in fact, what it means is that you have to care more for the ones in greatest need. So when we say all students, we default usually to white students. And again, an equity is not about salvationism. I say this because one of the things that happened in the 60s with the opening up to racially minoritized students, that we also created a lot of compensatory programs that were intended to help racially minoritized students assimilate to a predominantly white system of higher education. And there was a salvationist kind of personality or inclination. And that's not what equity is about. So what is equity about? Well, the way that I define it is as having three foci. I define it first as corrective justice, which goes along with the idea that higher education owes a racial debt. So equity is partly paying off that debt, particularly to the descendants of enslaved people, as well as other minoritized populations who have suffered the loss of land through colonization, through the appropriation of territory. I also see the definition of equity as being an anti-racist project, that when we do equity, we have to confront that our institutions of higher education are in fact racialized, and that racism is runs through the arteries of our institutions, because the majority, even those who are now Hispanic serving institutions, were founded at a time when they were predominantly white. They only predominantly had white students. And in fact, I mean, most of our institutions, even though now there may be more diversity, the faculty, the governing boards, and leadership are predominantly white. And the last definition or foci that I see for equity is the decentering of whiteness. That we have to make whiteness, magnify whiteness, and make it visible to higher education leaders and policymakers, philanthropies, and intermediary organizations. And this is something that we rarely ever talk about, whiteness. And because I think that there is a fear that it might feel offensive. So let me just say right now that whiteness is not about people. It's not about white people as such. Whiteness is about a discourse. It's about the way in which we do things, and it's about processes. And whiteness lives in our language. It lives in the ways in which we do things. And we all of us engage in it because that's how we have been socialized. So when I say decentering whiteness, I mean that we all have to learn how to do that. So to explain this a little bit more, I am sharing with you a sculpture. Some of you may have already seen this, me sharing it, because I find it to be fascinating as well as very helpful in explaining equity as racial justice and as decentering whiteness. So this is a sculpture that is in Copenhagen, and it was built to depict the inequality in worldwide wealth. And the sculpture has an inscription, and the inscription says, "I am sitting on the back of a man. He is sinking under the burden. I would do anything to help him except stepping down from his back." And I sometimes feel that this is the same thing that we do around issues of equity. So, for instance, we might say, we want more racially minoritized students to earn degrees, to complete their degrees or to transfer. And we are implementing, and I'm just using here one of the popular reforms, we are implementing pathways to support them. But we are not willing, or we will not consider, or we don't know how to do, how to consider how whiteness might be implicated in the very pathways that we are creating to help students. So that's one of the ways in which this sculpture speaks to me. Another one is, taking another current reform around developmental education, is that we want more racially minoritized students to earn degrees, and we are therefore eliminating developmental education and implementing core requisites. But we will not consider how whiteness is implicated in pedagogical practices in class and classroom culture. So, so that's the way that I see why I'm talking about decentering whiteness, because I see that we are very much concerned with implementing solutions, but often these solutions are not self-reflective about how whiteness is embedded in them. So equity is, I said before what equity was not. I'll say now also what else equity is about. Equity is about racial inequity that is created by faulty assumptions. So those faulty assumptions, and which I see as being, I see them reflected in many of the reforms that we are hoping will close those equity gaps. One of them is universalism. And I take this from Robin DiAngelo, who wrote White Fragility. And I see universalism in just about everything that relates to higher education reforms, in that they're pretty much written as for all students. They rarely ever name African American, Latinx, Indigenous students. There is an assumption that what works for all also works for racially minoritized students. And this universalism in part comes from an uncritical self-referencing among the people who create these reforms. Most of the reforms that we are implementing in our institutions of higher education have been created by white scholars, practitioners, organizations. And because they have not necessarily been taught to think about their whiteness as an identity, those solutions are very self-referential in terms of how they have experienced higher education. And we all, of course, do that in our own in our work. We draw on our experience. We draw on our culturally acquired experience that lives primarily under the subconscious. So for white individuals who are creating these solutions, the cultural knowledge that they're drawing on is typically comes from being socialized and being in networks that are predominantly white. So there also the problem of racial inequality. So that it's the problem of racial inequality is often framed as a problem of minoritized populations. And that's how we got the achievement gap. But it's not an achievement gap. It's a performance gap. And the problem of racial inequality is the problem of whiteness, because it has been created by institutions that have been unresponsive as well to the, we have diversified internally, but we have not changed our ways of doing things for the most part. Obviously, there are some changes. We also put too much faith in our own goodness. We believe that because we are anti-racist, that therefore, even if we don't name the populations that we are trying to impact, that they will benefit from our work. So we believe ourselves as being good people. So there is no way that we could be creating practices or reforms that are anti-equity. Inequity is also caused by the lack of racial literacy. We have not been taught how to be anti-racist. We have not been taught how to teach in ways that are anti-racist. We have not been taught how to make our classrooms not fall into anti-Blackness. In fact, I have to give a lecture this coming week to my colleagues in the PhD program on pedagogy, and the topic that I chose was about anti-Blackness pedagogy. Well, I have to tell you that it's not like I know a whole lot about it, and I will have to study up on it in order to be able to speak about it. But that's the point. We have not been taught how to engage in anti-racism as a practice, as a professional practice, and it is a skill. And finally, racial inequity is also created by hoarding power. That that the power to bring about transformation tends to be in the hands of a few, and it hasn't always opened up to organizations that one might call equity first organizations that are led by Black and Latinx and Indigenous leaders, and that have always been dedicated to racial equity as their mission. So I talked about whiteness, and here are three ways of thinking about whiteness. Ruth Frankberg, who is a professor at Penn State University and has written on whiteness, she defines it as that it's a location of structural advantage and of race privilege. And it is this structural advantage that makes it possible for white people often to not see racism that is taking place around them or in front of them. It is also a standpoint, a place from which white people look at themselves, at others, and at society. So my speaking about whiteness right now might seem strange because it is not part of the standpoint among individuals who are white. And finally, it's a set of cultural practices that are usually unmarked, unnamed. And we can see this in admissions practices. We can see this in hiring practices. There is actually an article in today's Inside Higher Education about admissions practices that are detrimental to the project of racial equity. So I have now talked about these issues somewhat abstractly. So I want to give you two examples of what it is that I mean by decentering whiteness. So first of all, one of the things that I have noticed is that in higher education, we are unwilling to talk about racism as a characteristic of our colleges. And often we do not take action in the face of racist acts. In fact, I just recently gave a survey around that, and many of the respondents said that they are reluctant, that they don't usually do something when they notice racist acts, and not noticing racialized patterns, for instance, in data or in participation in our classrooms. So the two examples that I'm going to talk about is one is a project that we recently did where we actually reviewed 115 equity plans that are required of community colleges. We did this in California. And one of the things, this is an equity plan, and one of the things that we found was that the plans, for the most part, demonstrate generic equity. They do not address racial equity specifically. We found that the majority of activity descriptions do not include references to specific racial groups, even though the metrics, the data that have to be used to develop these plans show that there are inequities by race and ethnicity. Most of the descriptions fall into what I just said, universalism, that they're focused on all students. Racism is never mentioned as a property, as a quality of institutions. No one really, except for one plan that I can recall, actually spoke about themselves as being a racialized institution. And most of the plans do not define the term equity. And this lack of definition of the term equity is actually rampant in just about every document that I've seen that, that invokes equity as one of their concerns. So here what I'm showing you some of our findings from this assessment. We found that, that while the metrics showed that there were inequalities, that the activities that were being proposed to address these inequalities, 87% were race neutral. So for instance, a college might say, we have inequality in transfer for African-American males. And, but the activity that was proposed to address that inequality typically was race neutral. We also found that 19% of all of the activities that were identified as race-specific in their metrics were also race-specific in their activity description, which means that 81% of the activities that should have been race-specific actually provide wrote up the activity in neutral language. The plans also showed that that generic equity rather than racial equity was not typically mentioned. The majority of the plans do not mention the term of racism at all. I think 14% of them did. And additionally, we found that the majority of activity descriptions were focused on decreasing equity gaps by implementing student service-oriented activities as opposed to classroom-focused activities, which is a real problem. And I think that this gets to the point that equity is often seen as a problem of providing services to students rather than changing the ways in which we deliver, for instance, instruction. So I'm going to go on here. So the other thing that we found was that most of the activities, the target of change were the students, not institutional actors. So this is another problem around how we are defining equity. And that's why I'm talking about decentering whiteness in definitions of equity. When we focus our attention on students and not on institutional actors and institutional structures, we are assuming that they function equitably, and that it is the students that need to be changed. So I'm going to now talk to you about another project that we have done that has inspired me to talk about decentering whiteness. I mentioned that we have a Gates project to look at policy and specifically how to develop capacity to implement reforms like the elimination of developmental education and pathways with a racial focus. So as part of that project, we decided to review 15 webinars that were training webinars on how to implement pathways as well as reforms to developmental education. And we created a protocol for doing this review. So here's what we found. In terms of the guided pathways webinar analysis, that equity was generalized, sporadic, raceless, and race evasive. This was in analysis of webinar trainings. There was a lack of emphasis on practitioner responsibility for racial equity, and there was a lack of diversity and equity expertise among those who were doing the presentations or the trainings. So here's some of the findings. Equity, as I said, was generalized, sporadic, raceless, and race evasive. And that was because there were 0 mentions of racial equity in the 15 webinar trainers. There were sporadic mentions of equity, but it was not defined. And equity was actually defined as focusing on all students. So we have a quote there from one of the instructors in the webinar, which says, when we say equity, we really mean supporting all students, which again is that problem of universalism that I mentioned earlier. And so equity means that all students will be supported. But in order for us to deal with the major racial inequities that our institutions have created, we cannot define now equity as all students. And that's what I mean, that we need to decenter whiteness from equity, because the notion of all students comes from that perspective, a perspective of whiteness. We also found that there was a lack of emphasis on the responsibility of practitioners for racial equity. There was no mention of racialization in the classroom, that our classrooms, race plays out in our classrooms. There was no mention of how faculty can be blind to how race is operating in their practices. And there was no mention of race-conscious inquiry. Like, for instance, looking at your grade book, disaggregated by race and ethnicity. So there was no emphasis really on pedagogy. We also found that there was a lack of diversity and equity expertise among presenters. So what you can see here is the majority of the presenters of these webinars were white, and there were just a handful of Latinx and Black presenters, which is interesting because these trainings are being done for a community college system that is primarily Latinx, and where whites are a very, very small number of the students. So to bring it back, it's whiteness is evidence in the ways in which these reforms are being designed, described, and how adopters are being trained for them. And because of this, if they actually function as equity focused, it will be perhaps they will, but I don't think so. So I see Yolanda, which I'm wondering if she's trying to tell me that I am done. So so I will finish. I'm going to skip this. So in thinking about this notion of reforms and specifically guided pathways, I started thinking, what if we had a guided pathways towards racial equity, rather than having, maybe can live side by side the other pathways. What I say here is, I reframe the problem. Community colleges and broad access four-year colleges, despite their racial and ethnic diversity, adhere to norms, values, practices of predominantly white institutions, and so on. So consequently, these institutions face serious performance problems. The leaders and instructors lack the racial literacy that is needed to analyze the ways in which their practices, as well as beliefs and values, have racial consequences. The dominance of whiteness as a discourse of higher education blinds leaders and instructors to their lack of racial literacy, and the habits of power, such as the right to define the problem and prescribe the solution, make it very difficult for leaders and faculty to get out of racially homogeneous networks. So this is what I created. As you know, many of you maybe in the audience are implementing Pathways. You know that Pathways has 4 pillars, and I kind of reconstructed these 4 pillars to focus not on students, but on institutions. And so the first pillar would be to develop racial literacy. I actually started writing a curriculum for it. The second pillar would be to deconstruct whiteness in institutional policies and practices. The third pillar would be to reconstruct anti-racist and humanistic policies and practices. And the last one would be to ensure institutional anti-racist learning and change. And they are referring to organizational learning. So in your conference that you will be going to for the next 5 days, you will be going to sessions that have promoting equity through purpose, advancing equity through momentum, building equity through structure, achieving equity through support. I urge you, as you're in these sessions, to think about some of the things that I have said and think about the ways in which what kinds of questions you might want to ask in connection to what I have shared with you. So I am very grateful for being invited to speak and for being forced to think as I wrote this specifically for Complete College America. Thank you very much. And Yolanda, I turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bensimon. That is excellent. And I did appear because I wanted to let you know we have so many questions in the chat. Folks are bursting at the seams. And so I wanted to, and I hope we may go over a little bit. So I don't know how much time you have, but I wanted to make sure we can get to as many questions as possible.
Okay, so I'm listening.
Okay, so one of the questions is, well, the first question everybody is asking is whether they can get a copy of the slides. And I will say that we will not be sharing the slides, but this recording will be shared. So you can go back and watch the recording again if you'd like more information.
Yes, and I'm not sharing it because these are ideas that I'm still working with.
Right. Exactly. So one question, Dr. Bensimon, is you use racially minoritized students. I've heard recommended naming of Black, Latinx, and Indigenous as a way for these students to be seen, or Black, Indigenous, and people of color. What's best, and does it depend on context or the audience?
I think that what is best is the contextualization of those words, language, those terms. And I say racially minoritized as a political statement because to signal that these individuals were not minorities, they were made into minorities. And then I also use Black, Latinx, and a PC, Indigenous students. And I will use sometimes students of color. I think that if I was only using students of color all the time, then that would be a trigger for me. But I don't use underrepresented students, for instance. I never use the term URM, which means underrepresented minorities, and it has been made into, URM. And if you're interested, I have written a paper on that. It's called the URM, the misbegotten data point.
Thank you. Another question, we had a couple of...
And stop calling me Dr. Bensimon.
Of course, Estela. How does one engage in pedagogy that is not anti-Black?
I think that what I said was that I'm still studying this, but I would say that one of the ways of doing that is by looking at your syllabus, for instance, and the content of the syllabus, and ask yourself, would a Black student or a Black woman or Black man be able to see themselves in my syllabus? Do they see themselves as knowledge creators? And in other presentations, I have shown a syllabus that does all of those things. So I think that part of Decentering Whiteness is looking at our syllabi and who do we represent as creators of knowledge. And some of you out there may be in the science areas, and you may be thinking, well, that doesn't apply to me. No. It does apply to you as well, because it is important to uplift the scientific accomplishments of Black and Latinx and Indigenous individuals. And even if it's just, like images in a syllabus that signal that.
And I would agree. I would also say even debunking some of these scientific theories of eugenics or about lower IQ and things of that nature really utilizes science to say those things are garbage.
Right. You can talk about racism in science, the Tuskegee experiment, the experiments that were conducted in Puerto Rico with women with birth control pill. And we just haven't been taught always those instances of racism in science.
Absolutely. Estela, someone asked this question. I'm going to give voice to the entire question because I want to make sure they're heard, but part of it you've already answered, so you can just answer the part you did not. So the person asked, what does racially minoritized mean? I think you've already explained that. And they also asked, what was your goal of using this term instead of others? But then they asked, has the term been, quote, market tested? Meaning, does it have the intended effects? How do racially minoritized students themselves feel about the use of this term?
I have not asked undergraduates how they feel about the term. I do know that my graduate students use the term in the same way that I do. Minoritized is a term coined by critical theorists and scholars of critical race theory. And it is a political statement. And maybe I should have explained it at the beginning, that that's what it is. So I never say minority. I always now say racially minoritized, just like I never really say equity anymore. I always say now racial equity, as a way of making my stance clear.
Just to that point, someone gave a comment. They said they loved your phrase, the project of racial equity. They believe it implies an ongoing effort that is possible. So they wanted to give you positive feedback on that.
Thank you.
Here's another question. I hear it stated and shown through data that indicates that practices intended to benefit students from racially marginalized groups benefit all students, not just the racially marginalized students. How does that square with equity as you describe it?
Yes, that's very true, actually. And practices that are focused on racially minoritized students actually bring benefits to all students, in part because faculty often have to work harder at thinking about the pedagogies around that. So all students benefit. All students, appreciate being taught about, for instance, Black literature, Black history. And it also, I think what it is that the faculty member who does that, there must be something else to them, to their ways of thinking about their role in relation to their students. That it's not just the content, but that there may be something about the, Bell Hooks is a scholar, a cultural scholar, a cultural critic, if you don't know who she is. And she, in her book, Transgressing to Teach, she talks about love, that you have to love your students. So I imagine that the faculty who tries that is trying very hard to see herself or himself in the students and vice versa. And that's why it may bring about positive outcomes. And it's not something that I have studied, but it's something that I have seen in the projects that we have.
Estela, someone asked the question, where and how can we best learn anti-racism and how to apply it to our professional practice?
I think that the way that one learns is the way that we learn most things. We learn by reading, often reading with others so that one can interact, because social interaction is a core practice of learning. So I would say that, so like, let's say that you decide, okay, I'm going to read Ibram X. Kendi's book on how to be an anti-racist. And, but I'm going to do more than read it. I'm going to think about each of those chapters, how they apply to my own practice. So that's one way of doing it. It's by reading that special issue of the New York Times, 1619, which is amazing. It's watching Ava DuVernay's 13th, the movie 13th, and While They Watch Us, which is about the Central Park Five. So I guess what I'm saying in part is educating yourself on these issues, and then we have, I showed you those professional development tapes. We need to create professional development that is created by Black and Latinx and Indigenous scholars, by D.L. Stewart, by Laurie Patton, by Eddie Cole, and I could go on and on. It's just that much of that work is at the margins of the reform movement. It has to be brought to the center of the reform movement.
And might I add, Estela, I get this question often a lot too. And I would say, you have to think if you're 50 years old, it took you 50 years to be inculcated into the whiteness that you've been ascribing to. You're not going to unlearn that in 50 days, right? So I think as you're going about educating yourself, also recognizing that this is going to be a lifelong journey and it's a process and not an address. And so you're going to really have to really take your time you want to learn these things and read and consume as much information as you can, but it cannot be a one and done, right? It's not going to be a weekend of binge watching all those movies and then you're going to get it. It's going to take time and practice. So I just wanted to add that.
Exactly. It is a skill, and part of learning a skill is being open to learning it, right? And there's a quote by Upton Sinclair. Let's see, something along the lines of a man resists understanding something when that understanding might affect their income, or something like that. I probably screwed it up, but that's what I think. Sometimes learning this, it is about power, like I showed in the sculpture. Are we willing to give up the power that we accrue from keeping things centered on whiteness?
Yes. Someone asked the question, thinking about our curriculum, how do you suggest that the word all be replaced in the following sentence? Are your goals, outcomes, and expectations attainable by all of your students? So they're asking if that's part of their strategy or their goals, how would they replace all with what? With what terminology?
I think that I would name the students, or I would say, who do I mean by all students? I just, and then let me just see about, and was the question about strategies? I think that the more important aspect of that question is, if strategies was part of the question, is to problematize the strategies, and in what ways will they serve Latinx, African Americans, Indigenous, and where did those strategies come from? Whose minds did they come?
Mm-hmm. This question resonated with me because the data you showed about how basically equity has been sort of relegated to student success and not embedded in the classroom. So the person asked the question, your data about anti-racism or lack of in instruction and pedagogy is striking. What recommendations do you have for state leaders, for example, SHIOs, who want to support racial equity in the classroom?
Well, I think that they need to, do what decenter whiteness, and SHIOs would need to first. I mentioned that we're talking about SHIOs in a particular state, not. Right. So I would say that that SHIO should look for the way that, just as you get people to help you with a strategic plan, you need to get people who are experts, not necessarily only at developmental education or pathways or predictive analytics. I didn't touch predictive analytics. I meant to, but I ran out of time. But people who can tell the SHIO in how these reforms made themselves not be responsive to racial equity. So that's what you need in part, and is to be able to see these reforms as products of culturally acquired knowledge by white individuals for the most part. And I don't say that pejoratively. I say it's the reality.
Absolutely. It's about time, but Estela, do you have a few more minutes to answer?
Yeah, fine.
Okay, and we'll go through a few more, but I just want to say to the audience that whatever does not get answered, we will get responses from Estela and get back to you. We'll try to send those out over the course of the rest of the week because we have lots of questions in the queue. So one person said they wanted to give you kudos. Thank you for this informative presentation. They've asked if you've seen examples that may serve as exemplars where faculty took the lead in evaluating curriculum as a response to addressing racial equity.
Yes, in all of the community colleges and other institutions that we work with, when through the Center for Urban Education, and even though I merged the center, that work is still going on. And all of those of you who are interested, you can go to the website for the Center for Urban Education. It's still up. There is a microsite that's Equity Tools. And there you will find all of the tools that we have created to examine pedagogical practices. There are observation protocols, there's a syllabus review protocol, there are case studies, there are videos, and then you can contact me if you have any questions about them. I highly recommend that you go to that microsite. I'm very proud of it, and it's really a great microsite.
Yes, I will add, if I must say so myself, it is wonderful. One of our members in Puerto Rico, Estela, made the point that in Puerto Rico, we do not use the term Latinx. People think that it refers to Latinos of Mexican descent. It is preferred to use Latinos and Latinas. Therefore, the context is very important in terms of which terminology you use.
Well, I would say que en Puerto Rico deben decir puertorriqueños y puertorriqueñas. No creo que tienen que usar las palabras del mainland.
Right.
Did you understand what I said?
I did, yes.
You don't need to use Latino or Latina in Puerto Rico. It's Puerto Rican.
Right. Love it. Someone asked about white fragility and how do we focus on decentering whiteness in institutions where you're also having to navigate issues of white fragility?
With a lot of patience. You have to find people in leadership positions who who are willing to confront that. I mean, that's part of the problem, that if our leaders don't make that a norm, then it becomes very, very difficult. And I don't have I don't have the solution. I know that it exists, and sometimes I probably would say ignore them unless they are so crucial to the equity project that you cannot do without them. But yes, that's a major problem in all of our institutions of higher education. And that's why I say that, those are the very same people who may be saying Black Lives Matter. And yet, when they are confronted with their own privilege or their own blindness, they become offended. And that's the problem. And that is pervasive.
Yes. A lot of folks in the chat were also talking about, for those who work in state government, in particular in SHIO offices, are finding difficulty with even having this conversation. They find that having the conversation makes people uncomfortable, especially because those in leadership tend not to be members of the Black, Latino, or Asian or Pacific Islander or indigenous communities. And so they asked, what advice do you have for them, especially if they are not the SHIO, but are just a staffer in state government office? How could they even advance this conversation?
Yeah, I would say, so, my philosophy on this is that I don't try to change people's minds. What I go for is changing the practices. So what I would say to you is, in a SHIO office, you probably do a whole bunch of stuff with data, right? So start asking questions. Why aren't we looking at these results by race and ethnicity? And or if you are creating a new document, go to our website and use one of our tools for policy analysis, where you can actually do quickly a word search and be able to see how that document is not addressing potentially a problem in your state that has to do with with minoritized students. I mean, if you're in a state like Texas, or in a state like, well, just about every state nowadays, really, if you're not realizing that that is part of your responsibility, it's for your own well-being. Tell the SHIELD, it's so that when you retire, you will have a source of revenue for your Social Security. Because if these groups do not get a college education, you will suffer in your Social Security and you won't be able to sell your house.
Love it. Someone also wanted to give this feedback that they feel it's really important to study the Puerto Rican students who have recently migrated to the US because they grew up as a part of a majority. And then when they move to the US, their self-concepts are challenged because they now are going to be racially minoritized. So just wanted to make that point.
Yeah, I think that happens. That happened to me also, coming to the United States. So yeah, that's what happens. And I think that Audrey Edwards, who just recently released a book, talks about that, about how she went to Paris after President Trump was elected, because she had decided to leave the country. And she talks about how you become a minority, where in Paris, she wasn't a minority because the minorities were Africans. And so, yeah, it has to do with it happens here when you move to the United States because of our racial hierarchies, and because Puerto Rico is a colonized island.
Another attendee asks, how do we discuss or address the performance gap without creating stereotype threat?
Of institutions. So when I said performance gap, I was talking about institutions having a performance gap. And so I'm not really concerned about institutions experiencing stereotype threat. They don't have that. They have never been made to feel insecure. So I don't think that would be an issue. For students, for sure it is. But I think we have to stop talking about the performance gap of students. We need to talk about why is it that the University of Southern California, I'll use my own institution, is incapable of creating the same outcomes it creates for white students for Latinx or for Black students. That's the question we have to ask. What is it about the way we do things that we perform so poorly for racially minoritized students?
Absolutely. Estela, you mentioned guided pathways in your presentation, and I'll make this the last question because I want to be respectful of your time. But as I thought about that, some of the questions in the chat addressed this, so I thought I could amalgamate them into this one question. How would you say that anti-racism across some of our other strategies in the completion movement, you also referenced co-requisite in one of your examples, but when you think about anti-racism, with the field being overwhelmingly white, what needs to happen to resolve the issue of those leading policy and technical assistance? There's this chasm then between who's leading some of the efforts in terms of policy and technical assistance, and then the strategies themselves and how they get resolved.
I could answer that question in many ways. I think that is organizational composition. Okay, I am here as your keynote speaker today.
Yes.
And with respect to Stan Jones, who was the previous president and died an untimely death, I'm not sure that I would be your keynote speaker previously. And so it matters how leaders think about these things. And the same thing in your organizations. If you are predominantly white organizations, you have to seek people out to bring in those different perspectives. But if you live in close networks, then that won't happen. The next thing I'll say about reforms, I believe that the reform of Dev Ed is an anti-racist practice and policy. I truly believe that, because the students who have been warehoused in those remedial education courses are predominantly Black, Latinx, and Indigenous. Therefore, I think it's very important to think about how to implement that policy in anti-racist ways so that it doesn't lose that power. And I don't feel that it's doing that because everyone is focusing on the structural change and not on the pedagogical changes that need to happen in order to, when students are put into the college level courses, that we need to look at the faculty. I mean, just because we are doing away with the remedial education courses, the faculty are still the same. And they may not really agree with the change. And so that's what I'm worried about.
And would you agree that the way that faculty advisors as well as non-faculty advisors guide students is also a factor?
Absolutely. And many of them, you remember that I used the term salvationist?
Yes.
Well, advisors sometimes suffer from salvationism, and they may think that the right thing for their students is to steer them away from the college level course because they will fail. And so they might redirect them to still the developmental education course. It's kind of like that professor at UCLA who has the undermatch theory, or I think it's something like that, where he thinks that the minoritized students should not go to highly selective institutions because they will fail, that it would be better for them to go to institutions where they will feel successful. That is all condescending. Yes. and racist.
Dr. Estela Mara Bensimon, we will end on that note. I could go on and on with you for hours and hours, but I get the benefit of speaking to you regularly. So I appreciate your time. I know our audience, this was one of our highest sessions for registration. So thank you for bringing us together on this conversation. And I look forward to folks hopefully reading your book. It is a wonderful text, and I think it will also give them information. Please visit the Q website that Dr. Bensimon provided to you, the Center for Urban Education, and look at those tips and toolkits and resources there. Any other information, Estela, that you'd like to share in terms of contacting or getting information about what you've said today?
I'm very easy to find. You can write to me, send me an email. And if you disagree with me, I invite you to send me an email as well. So, and I am fairly responsive.
Fairly.
I'm pretty responsive.
Absolutely.
So thank you so much. I am so sorry that I cannot see the audience. And doing this like this, it's hard. And I hope that you will invite me to do something in person in the future, Yolanda.
Absolutely. I can't wait for us to get together in person again soon.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. Have a